The phone buzzed on the kitchen counter at 8 in the evening, and Claire Bennett stared at the candles she had lit an hour ago, now half melted, their flames swaying over a table set for two. She read the message from her husband, Daniel Hart, for the third time. Something came up at the office. "Don't wait for me," she did not cry. She had stopped crying over things like this 2 years ago. She blew out the candles one by one, wrapped the untouched food in foil, and sat alone in the quiet house, listening to the clock on the wall count the seconds of a night that was supposed to be their 10th anniversary. This was not the first canceled dinner, and it would not be the last. But there was something different about tonight, something Claire could not yet name. Maybe it was the silence in the house that no longer felt uncomfortable. Maybe it was the fact that she did not check the door every few minutes anymore, waiting for headlights in the driveway. She simply existed in the moment, calm and steady, the way a person feels after they have finally accepted a truth they fought against for a long time. Daniel arrived home close to midnight. He found Claire already in bed, her back turned toward his side, the lamp switched off. He undressed quietly in the dark, careful not to wake her, though he did not actually know if she was asleep or only pretending. Either way was easier for both of them. He lay down beside her, staring at the ceiling, running through the numbers from the meeting that had kept him so late. And within minutes, his mind had already left the bedroom and returned to spreadsheets and deadlines. He did not think about the candles. He did not know they had ever been lit. 3 years earlier, things had looked entirely different. Daniel had been promoted to regional manager at a logistics company, a role he had wanted since the day he started there. The promotion came with more money, a bigger office, and a title that made his father proud when he mentioned it at family dinners. It also came with longer hours, more travel, and a phone that never seemed to stop ringing. At first, Claire had been supportive. She understood ambition. She had her own career as a school counselor, a job she loved because it let her help children, who reminded her, in some small way, of herself at that age, uncertain, and searching for someone who would simply pay attention. But paying attention was exactly what began to disappear between her and Daniel. In the beginning, he still tried. He would text her during his lunch break, just a short message asking how her day was going. He would call from the airport when his flights were delayed, complaining about the noise and the crowds, and she would laugh and tell him to buy a coffee and relax. Those small moments were like little threads holding the fabric of their marriage together. Slowly, one at a time, without either of them noticing exactly when, the threads began to snap. It started with missed calls, then missed dinners, then missed birthdays that were remembered a day late, apologized for with a rushed phone call, and a promise to make it up to her, a promise that rarely materialized into anything more than a bouquet of flowers left on the kitchen counter with a short note. Claire kept every one of those notes in a drawer for a while, believing that somewhere underneath the busy schedule was still the man who used to write her letters when they were only dating. The man who once drove 4 hours in the rain just to bring her soup when she was sick. She began to notice a pattern in herself too, a pattern she did not like. She would plan something special, a weekend trip, a dinner reservation, a movie night, and she would feel a flicker of hope each time, thinking maybe this would be the moment Daniel remembered how to be present. And each time the plan fell apart because of work, that flicker of hope grew a little smaller. Hope, she was learning, was not something that lasted forever, without being fed. It needed attention, just like everything else in a marriage, and hers was slowly starving. Claire had a younger sister named Grace, who lived 2 towns over, and it was Grace who first noticed the change in her sister's voice during their weekly phone calls. Claire used to talk about Daniel constantly, small stories about things he had said or done, complaints mixed with affection. Now she barely mentioned him at all. When Grace asked how things were going between them, Claire would simply say fine, and change the subject to something about her students or a book she was reading. Grace did not push. She figured Claire would talk when she was ready, not realizing that Claire had already stopped believing there was anything left to talk about. At work, Daniel was thriving. His numbers were good, his team respected him, and his superiors spoke about him as someone destined for even bigger things within the company. He took pride in this. He told himself that everything he was doing, the long hours, the missed dinners, the forgotten calls, was for his family. He was building something. He was securing their future. It was a story he repeated to himself often enough that he genuinely believed it, without pausing to ask Claire whether this was the kind of future she actually wanted. one built on an empty side of the bed and cold dinners wrapped in foil. One evening, Daniel came home earlier than usual, around 7, which was rare enough that Claire actually looked up in surprise when she heard the garage door. He walked into the kitchen, loosened his tie, and asked what was for dinner, as if this was an ordinary Tuesday and not the first time in 3 weeks he had walked through that door before 9 at night. Claire told him there was pasta on the stove, and he thanked her, sat down, and ate while scrolling through emails on his phone. She watched him from across the table, waiting for him to ask about her day, waiting for a single question that showed he still saw her as a person and not simply as a fixture in the house he came home to. The question never came. He finished eating, thanked her again, and went upstairs to take a shower before settling into his home office to finish more work before bed. Claire cleared the table alone, washed the dishes alone, and sat on the porch for a while, alone, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. She thought about the woman she used to be, the one who laughed loudly and danced in the kitchen while cooking, who used to call Daniel just to hear his voice in the middle of a busy day. She wondered when exactly that woman had quietly slipped away, replaced by someone who moved through her own home like a guest, careful not to disturb anyone, expecting nothing in return. It would be easy to say that Daniel was a bad man, but that was not entirely true, and Claire knew this better than anyone. He was not cruel. He never raised his voice at her, never said anything designed to hurt her. His failure was quieter than that, and in some ways more painful, because there was no single moment she could point to and say, "This is where it went wrong." Instead, there were 1,000 small moments, each one small enough to forgive on its own, but together forming a wall so tall that Claire no longer remembered what it felt like to be truly seen by her own husband. Their friends still saw them as a solid couple. At gatherings, Daniel would place a hand on Claire's back, introduce her proudly to colleagues, tell stories about how they met in college, both of them assigned to the same study group for a class neither of them particularly enjoyed. People often commented on how well matched they seemed, how comfortable they looked together. Claire smiled through these comments, because there was truth buried somewhere in them, memories of a real love that had once existed and had not entirely disappeared, only buried under years of neglect that no one outside the house could see. At home, though, there was a version of Claire that only she knew, the version who sat in her car outside the grocery store some evenings, in no hurry to go home to an empty house even though her husband technically lived there, the version who scrolled through old photographs of their wedding day, staring at the wide smile on both their faces, trying to remember what it had felt like to be that certain about anything. The version who had started, without fully admitting it to herself, to build an entire private world inside her own mind, one where she did not wait for Daniel anymore, one where she quietly stopped needing him to notice her at all. There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists inside a marriage, different from the loneliness of being single. It is the loneliness of reaching for someone who is right there beside you, and finding nothing on the other end. Claire experienced this loneliness almost daily, though she rarely spoke of it to anyone, not even Grace. She had convinced herself that speaking about it would make it more real, and as long as she kept it locked away, she could still function, still show up to work with a smile, still be the reliable friend, the dependable sister, the calm and composed wife that everyone expected her to be. But something was shifting inside her, slow and steady as a tide pulling back from the shore. It was not anger. Anger would have been loud, would have led to arguments, tears, confrontations that might have forced Daniel to notice what was happening. What Claire felt instead was quieter and far more dangerous to their marriage, a kind of gentle detachment, a letting go of expectations one at a time, until there was almost nothing left to expect. She stopped waiting up for him. She stopped saving stories to tell him about her day. She stopped hoping he would ask. On the night of their canceled anniversary, after Daniel had fallen asleep beside her without knowing what the day even meant, Claire lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought about the 10 years behind her, the wedding, the small apartment they shared before buying the house, the fights over silly things like whose turn it was to do laundry, and the deep, easy laughter that used to fill their evenings. She thought about all of it, and then she thought about tonight. The candles, the foil-wrapped food, the silence, and she felt something settle inside her chest, calm and final, though she did not yet have words for what it meant. She got up quietly, careful not to wake him, and walked downstairs to the kitchen. The candles sat cold on the counter where she had left them. She picked one up and turned it over in her hands, remembering how excited she had been earlier that day, choosing the scent, setting the table just right, imagining Daniel walking through the door with flowers in his hand, surprising her the way he used to. It had been a small, hopeful dream, one of the last ones she allowed herself to have about him. She placed the candle back down and looked around the kitchen, at the life they had built together, the photographs on the refrigerator, the coffee mugs that still matched from their wedding registry, the calendar on the wall marked with appointments and school events, but no dates circled for the two of them. Somewhere in the quiet of that kitchen, Claire made a decision she did not speak aloud, not even to herself in clear words. She simply stopped hoping. And in a marriage, when hope disappears quietly like that, without a single argument to mark its passing, it is often more dangerous than the loudest fight could ever be. The next morning, Daniel woke up rested, unaware that anything significant had shifted in the house overnight. He kissed Claire's forehead before leaving for work, told her he loved her the way he always did, out of habit more than anything else, and walked out the door to catch his early flight for a business trip. Claire watched him go from the kitchen window, coffee in hand, and felt nothing stir inside her. No worry about his flight, no countdown to his return, no ache of missing him before he had even left. It was, in its own quiet way, the most honest morning of their marriage in years, though neither of them yet understood exactly what it meant, or how far the distance between them had truly grown. Grace called Claire on a Sunday afternoon, her voice bright with excitement, about a trip she was planning with her husband, and somewhere in the middle of the conversation she asked, almost as an afterthought, when Claire and Daniel had last taken a trip together. Claire paused longer than she meant to, before answering that she could not quite remember. Maybe 3 years ago, before Daniel's promotion changed everything. Grace laughed it off, assuming Claire was simply exaggerating, but the pause stayed with her long after the call ended, a small warning bell she chose not to examine too closely. Claire's days had settled into a rhythm that no longer included much room for Daniel. She woke early, prepared for her work at the school, spent her days surrounded by children who needed her attention, and gave it back tenfold in small ways. A hug in the hallway, a drawing left on her desk, a shy smile from a student who had finally opened up about something difficult at home. In many ways, her job had become the place where she felt most alive, most useful, most seen. It was a strange irony that she found more genuine connection with 8-year-olds during recess duty than she did with the man she had promised to spend her life with. In the evenings, she began filling her time with things that had nothing to do with Daniel at all. She joined a book club that met every other Wednesday at a small cafe near her school, a group of 5 women who talked about novels for the first 30 minutes, and then spent the rest of the evening talking about their actual lives, their marriages, their children, their frustrations and small joys. Claire looked forward to these Wednesdays more than she looked forward to almost anything else in her week. She never mentioned much about Daniel in those conversations, deflecting gently whenever someone asked, though the other women, sharp as women often are about these things, began to notice the careful way she avoided the subject. One of the women in the book club, a warm and direct woman named Lauren, pulled Claire aside after one meeting and asked plainly if everything was all right at home. Claire almost lied, almost gave the automatic answer she gave everyone, but something about the quiet cafe and the concern in Lauren's eyes made her pause. She admitted, in a small voice, that she and Daniel had grown distant, that he worked constantly, that she had stopped expecting much from him at all. Lauren listened without judgment, without offering easy solutions, simply nodding and telling Claire that she was allowed to want more than she was getting, that wanting attention from your own husband was not asking for too much. That conversation planted something in Claire that continued to grow over the following weeks. She began paying closer attention to her own feelings, instead of constantly managing Daniel's schedule and moods around his work. She started going to a yoga class on Tuesday evenings, something she had wanted to try for years but never had time for, because she was always waiting to see if Daniel would be home early enough for them to do something together. She stopped waiting. The yoga class became another small piece of a life she was quietly building for herself, separate from her marriage, a life that felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely her own. Meanwhile, Daniel remained largely unaware of these changes, though there were small signs he chose not to examine. He noticed that Claire seemed busier than usual, that she was often not home when he arrived, something that used to bother him but now felt convenient, since it meant he did not have to explain his own late arrivals or apologize for missed plans. He noticed that she talked less about her day when they did happen to share dinner together, that conversations between them had become shorter, more functional, focused on logistics like whose turn it was to pick up dry cleaning or when the car needed servicing. He told himself this was simply what happened to marriages after a decade together, that the early passion naturally faded into a comfortable partnership, and that comfort, not excitement, was the true measure of a lasting relationship. It was a convenient belief, one that allowed him to continue prioritizing his career without confronting the possibility that something deeper was wrong. He had built an entire professional identity around being someone who delivered results, who solved problems, who never let his team down. It did not occur to him that the same standards he applied at the office might be entirely absent from his own home. Then came the call that would mark the true turning point in their marriage, though neither of them recognized it as such at the time. Claire's father, Edward Bennett, a retired mechanic who had lived alone since his wife passed away 5 years earlier, was rushed to the hospital after collapsing at his home. Grace called Claire in a panic, her voice shaking, telling her that their father had suffered a serious heart episode, and doctors were preparing him for emergency surgery. Claire's hands trembled as she grabbed her keys, calling Daniel immediately, needing him beside her more than she had needed anything in years. Daniel was in the middle of an important client presentation when her call came through. He saw her name flash on his phone screen, hesitated for a moment, and then silenced it, telling himself he would call her back the second the meeting ended. 15 minutes later, when he finally checked his phone, he saw 3 missed calls and a text message explaining that her father was in surgery, and she was on her way to the hospital alone. He felt a flicker of concern, but the client meeting was not yet finished, and there was a critical decision still being negotiated that could affect an entire quarter's numbers for his team. He sent Claire a message telling her he was so sorry, that he would come as soon as he could get away, that he loved her and hoped everything would be all right. Then he returned to the meeting, believing, in his mind, that he was making a reasonable choice, that the situation seemed serious but manageable, and that his presence at that particular moment could not change the outcome of her father's surgery anyway. It was the kind of rationalization that felt sensible in isolation, but devastating in the context of everything that had come before it. Claire arrived at the hospital alone, sat in the waiting room alone, and endured 3 of the longest hours of her life without her husband beside her. Grace arrived shortly after, and the 2 sisters held hands in silence, watching the doors of the operating room, waiting for any sign of news. Around them, other families sat together, husbands with arms wrapped around wives, adult children comforting each other, entire support systems gathered in the face of crisis. Claire noticed this, could not help but notice it, the empty chair beside her, where Daniel should have been sitting. Daniel arrived at the hospital nearly 4 hours after Claire's first call. His presentation finally concluded, his tie loosened, his expression apologetic. By then, the surgery was already over, and doctors had informed Claire and Grace that their father had made it through and was stable, though he would need weeks of recovery and lifestyle changes moving forward. Daniel found Claire sitting quietly in a hospital chair, her eyes red but dry, her posture straight and composed, in a way that felt more unsettling than if she had been sobbing. He knelt beside her chair, took her hand, and apologized repeatedly, explaining about the client, the presentation, the impossible timing of it all. Claire listened to his explanation without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished speaking, she simply nodded and thanked him for coming, her voice calm and distant in a way that made his stomach twist uncomfortably, though he could not identify exactly why. He wanted her to be angry with him. Anger, at least, would have felt like something he could apologize his way out of. This quiet acceptance felt like something else entirely, something he did not yet have a name for. That night, after they returned home, and Daniel had fallen asleep, exhausted from the stress of the day, Claire sat alone at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen. She had not planned to write anything, but the words came pouring out of her before she fully understood what she was doing. She wrote about the empty chair at the hospital. She wrote about the 4 hours she had waited alone while her father's life hung in the balance. She wrote about every canceled dinner, every forgotten birthday, every moment over the past several years when she had needed Daniel and found him absent, physically present in the house perhaps, but absent in every way that actually mattered. She wrote for nearly an hour, filling page after page with everything she had never said aloud, every disappointment she had swallowed silently, for the sake of keeping the peace. every small death of hope she had experienced, without ever telling him the damage it caused. When she finished, she folded the pages carefully and placed them inside an envelope, without addressing it to anyone, without any clear plan for what she would do with it. She simply needed to release the words somewhere, and putting them on paper felt safer than saying them aloud to a man who, she suspected, might not truly hear them, even if she did. She placed the envelope inside an old shoebox in the back of her closet, tucked beneath a stack of sweaters she rarely wore, and went to bed feeling lighter than she had in months, though nothing about her situation had actually changed. The letter sat there, forgotten by everyone except her, a quiet record of everything she had endured, and everything she had decided, without fully realizing it yet, to stop fighting for. In the weeks that followed her father's surgery, Claire visited him almost daily, helping him adjust to a new diet, driving him to physical therapy appointments, sitting with him during long afternoons as he slowly regained his strength. Daniel offered to help a handful of times, but work always seemed to interfere, and eventually Claire stopped asking, handling the entire situation herself, the way she had grown accustomed to handling most difficult things in her life. Edward noticed his daughter's quiet resilience, and one afternoon, while she was helping him with his exercises, he asked her gently how things were really going with Daniel. Claire hesitated before answering honestly for the first time to someone in her family. She told her father that she felt like she had been carrying their marriage alone for a long time, that she loved Daniel in some distant, memory-shaped way, but that she no longer felt loved back in any way she could actually feel in her daily life. Edward listened carefully, his hand resting gently over hers, and told her that a marriage where one person carries everything alone eventually breaks, no matter how much love existed at the beginning. He did not tell her what to do. He simply wanted her to know that her feelings were valid, that she was not imagining the distance she felt. Those words settled deep inside Claire, giving her a strange kind of permission she had not realized she needed. She began to understand that her exhaustion, her quiet withdrawal, her growing indifference toward Daniel's absence, was not a personal failure on her part, but a natural response to years of feeling unseen. She stopped blaming herself for no longer feeling excited when Daniel came home. She stopped forcing herself to initiate conversations he never seemed interested in continuing. She allowed herself, for the first time, to simply exist as she was, without pretending everything was fine for the sake of appearances. Daniel, meanwhile, continued moving through his days with the same relentless focus on his career, unaware that somewhere in the back of his own closet sat a letter containing every unspoken truth about the damage his neglect had caused. He believed, as he often did, that the crisis with Claire's father had passed, and life had returned to its normal rhythm. He did not notice that Claire had grown quieter around him, that she asked him fewer questions about his day, that she no longer seemed to care whether he came home early or late. He mistook her calm for peace, when in truth it was the calm of someone who had simply stopped expecting anything different. 6 months passed after Edward's surgery, and life in the Hart household settled into a routine that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. Daniel continued climbing the ladder at his company, now overseeing 3 regional offices instead of 1, a responsibility that came with even longer hours and more frequent travel. Claire continued teaching, continued caring for her recovering father, continued attending her book club and yoga classes, continued building a life that revolved less and less around her husband's presence. One evening, Daniel returned from a 4-day business trip to find the house unusually quiet, even by their standards. He called out for Claire as he set down his suitcase, and when she did not immediately answer, a small flicker of unease passed through him, quickly replaced by relief when he found her reading in the living room, headphones in, unaware he had even walked in. He tapped her shoulder gently, and she looked up, removing one earbud, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. He told her about his trip, about a difficult client he had managed to secure, about the hotel that had upgraded his room unexpectedly. She listened, nodded at the appropriate moments, asked a few polite questions, and then returned to her book once he finished speaking. There was no argument, no visible tension, nothing that Daniel could point to as evidence that something was wrong. And yet, walking up the stairs to unpack his suitcase, he felt an unfamiliar hollowness settle in his chest, a sense that something in the house had shifted while he was away, though he could not identify what. He mentioned this feeling briefly to his colleague and close friend at work, a man named Peter, over drinks one evening after a long day. Peter, who had gone through a difficult divorce himself several years earlier, listened carefully as Daniel described the strange distance he had noticed in Claire, the quietness, the lack of complaints even when he canceled plans, the calm acceptance that used to bother him, but that he had recently begun appreciating as a kind of peace. Peter set down his glass and asked Daniel directly when the last time was that he had asked Claire about her own dreams, her own fears, anything beyond the logistics of running a household together. Daniel opened his mouth to answer and found, to his own quiet horror, that he could not remember. He tried to recall a recent conversation where Claire had shared something meaningful about herself, something beyond scheduling or small talk, and the memory simply was not there. Peter told him gently that the absence of complaints from a partner was not always a sign of contentment. Sometimes, he said, it was the opposite. Sometimes silence meant someone had simply given up trying to be heard. Daniel laughed off the comment at the time, insisting that Claire was simply busy with her own projects, that their marriage was solid even if it looked different from the outside. But Peter's words stayed with him longer than he expected, surfacing at odd moments over the following weeks, during quiet drives home, during meetings when his mind should have been elsewhere. He began paying closer attention to Claire, though not closely enough to actually change his behavior in any meaningful way. He noticed she had rearranged the furniture in the living room, without asking his opinion, something she used to always run by him first. He noticed she had started sleeping earlier, no longer waiting up even on nights when he texted that he would be home by 10. He noticed, too, that she had started going out on Friday evenings with her book club friends, coming home late, laughing with them in the driveway before finally coming inside, a lightness in her voice that he realized, uncomfortably, he had not heard directed toward him in longer than he cared to admit. He told himself he should ask her about these friends, should show more interest in this part of her life she was building, but work always seemed to demand his attention first, and the intention quietly faded before he ever acted on it. One Saturday morning, Daniel woke up later than usual, a rare weekend without any scheduled calls or meetings, and found the house empty. Claire had left a note on the counter, explaining she had gone to visit her father and would be back in the afternoon, along with a reminder about a dinner reservation with his parents that evening, a commitment she had made weeks earlier that he had apparently forgotten entirely. He stared at the note for a long moment, feeling an unfamiliar discomfort at how disconnected he had become from his own family's schedule, relying entirely on Claire to remember and organize everything, while he focused solely on his career. He spent that morning wandering through the house, restless in a way he rarely allowed himself to be, his mind usually so occupied with work that stillness felt foreign and uncomfortable. He walked into their bedroom and opened Claire's closet, not searching for anything specific, simply looking, perhaps for some clue about the woman his wife had quietly become, while he was busy building spreadsheets and quarterly reports. He saw her clothes organized neatly by color, her shoes lined up along the closet floor, and tucked in the back corner, beneath a stack of sweaters, an old shoebox he did not recognize. He almost reached for it, curiosity pulling at him, but then he heard the garage door open downstairs, signaling Claire's return, and he quickly closed the closet, feeling an odd mixture of guilt and unease at having been caught, even though he had done nothing wrong, simply looked at his own wife's belongings in his own home. He went downstairs to greet her, and she smiled at him, a real smile this time, telling him about her father's improved strength during physical therapy, and for a moment, watching her animated expression as she spoke, Daniel felt a small ache of longing for the woman he used to know so well, the woman whose stories he used to hang on to eagerly, instead of half listening while checking his phone. That evening, at dinner with his parents, Daniel's mother, a sharp and observant woman named Patricia, commented casually on how tired Claire looked lately, asking if everything was all right between them. Claire brushed off the comment gracefully, mentioning her father's recovery as the source of her exhaustion, though Daniel noticed she avoided his eyes when she said it. His father, a quieter man who rarely offered unsolicited opinions, glanced at Daniel with an expression that seemed to carry unspoken concern, though he said nothing directly. Driving home that night, Daniel finally worked up the nerve to ask Claire if everything was truly all right between them, a question he had been avoiding for months without fully admitting it to himself. Claire was quiet for a long moment before answering, choosing her words carefully. She told him that she was tired, not just from caring for her father, but tired in a deeper way, tired of carrying most of their marriage on her own shoulders for years. She said this calmly, without accusation, without raising her voice, which somehow made the words land even heavier than if she had shouted them. Daniel felt defensive immediately, his instinct to explain, to justify, to point out everything he had provided for their family through his hard work. He started to speak, but something in Claire's expression, a weary patience that suggested she had heard this defense many times before in her own mind, stopped him. Instead, he asked her, genuinely, what she needed from him. Claire looked out the passenger window for a long moment before answering that she did not know anymore, that she had needed so many things for so long without receiving them, that she had stopped keeping track of what she actually wanted. The conversation ended there, neither of them fully resolving anything, but something had shifted between them that night, a crack finally appearing in the careful surface both had maintained for so long. Daniel promised, sincerely this time, that he would try to be more present, that he understood he had let his career overshadow their marriage, that he wanted to fix things before it was too late. Claire nodded, thanked him for saying so, but her expression carried a caution that suggested she had heard similar promises before, promises that dissolved within days, once the pressures of work returned. For about 2 weeks after that conversation, Daniel genuinely tried. He left work earlier several evenings, cooked dinner twice, something he had not done in years, and asked Claire detailed questions about her day, her students, her friends from book club. Claire responded to these efforts with polite warmth, appreciating the gestures without fully allowing herself to believe they would last. She had been disappointed too many times to invest hope in changes that history had taught her rarely held. Her caution proved justified when a major crisis emerged at Daniel's company, a client threatening to pull a significant contract, requiring Daniel's immediate and near-constant attention for nearly 3 weeks straight. His early efforts collapsed under the pressure, replaced once again by late nights, missed dinners, and distracted conversations. Claire watched this reversal without surprise, without anger, simply confirming what she had already suspected, that Daniel's good intentions, however genuine in the moment, would always lose out to the demands of his career whenever real pressure arrived. It was during this stressful period that Claire found herself, late one night while Daniel was still at the office, sitting again at the kitchen table with her notebook, adding new pages to the collection she had started after her father's surgery months earlier. She wrote about the 2 weeks of effort she had witnessed, the small hope it had briefly stirred in her, and the quiet devastation of watching that hope collapse once again under the weight of his job. She wrote that she no longer believed change was possible, not because Daniel was incapable of change, but because he had never truly believed their marriage required it, as urgently as his career demanded his attention. She placed these new pages into the same envelope tucked away in the shoebox in her closet, the collection of letters growing slowly over time, an entire private history of her disappointment that existed just feet away from where Daniel slept most nights, completely unaware of its existence. Each letter, she added, felt like another small release, another piece of honesty she could not yet speak aloud but needed to express somewhere, if only to herself. Grace, sensing something had changed in her sister during a visit shortly after, finally asked Claire directly if she was thinking about leaving Daniel. Claire considered the question seriously before answering, surprising herself with how calmly she was able to discuss it. She told Grace that she was not actively planning to leave, but that she had stopped fighting to save what they had. She said it felt less like giving up and more like accepting reality, the way a person eventually stops running toward a mirage in the desert, no matter how convincing it once appeared from a distance. Grace asked if Daniel knew how she truly felt, and Claire admitted that she had tried to tell him in small ways over the years, through quiet requests, through the careful conversation in the car after his parents' dinner, but that words alone never seemed to translate into lasting change. She said something Grace would remember for a long time afterward, that some people needed to lose something completely before they understood its true value, and she feared Daniel was one of those people, though she no longer had the energy or the desire to wait around and prove herself right. As the weeks turned back into Daniel's familiar pattern of constant work and diminishing presence at home, Claire's emotional withdrawal deepened in ways that were nearly invisible to anyone who did not know her intimately. She stopped mentioning her frustrations altogether, not because they had disappeared, but because she had finally accepted that voicing them changed nothing. She began planning small trips with Grace and her book club friends, instead of hoping Daniel would join family outings. She began, quietly and steadily, constructing a life that no longer depended on her husband's attention to feel complete. a life where his absence caused barely a ripple anymore. Daniel, absorbed once again in resolving his company's client crisis, remained unaware of just how far this quiet transformation had progressed. He believed, based on the relative calm at home and the absence of any dramatic confrontations, that their earlier conversation had settled things, that Claire understood the demands of his career and had returned to her usual patient acceptance of his schedule. He did not realize that her patience had not returned at all. It had simply transformed into something far more permanent, a peaceful indifference built on the ashes of hope she had finally allowed herself to release. A year slipped by almost without notice, the kind of year that feels short in memory, but had actually been filled with countless small moments, each one adding another quiet layer of distance between Daniel and Claire. Daniel's company completed a major merger, expanding his responsibilities even further, a development that most people in his position would have viewed as an incredible achievement. He did view it that way, celebrating with his team, accepting congratulations from colleagues, feeling a genuine sense of professional pride that had become, in many ways, the primary source of validation in his life. At home, life had become something closer to a well-organized partnership between two people who shared a house and a set of responsibilities, rather than a marriage built on emotional intimacy. Claire and Daniel divided household tasks efficiently, communicated clearly about schedules, and rarely argued, mostly because there was little left between them worth arguing over. They had, without either of them fully articulating it, settled into a comfortable coexistence that resembled peace, but was built entirely on the absence of real connection. Daniel began noticing small things that unsettled him, though he continued pushing these observations aside whenever they surfaced. Claire no longer reached for his hand during car rides, something she used to do automatically for years. She no longer left him notes on the counter, with little hearts drawn beside her handwriting, a habit from earlier in their marriage that had quietly disappeared, without either of them commenting on its absence. She no longer seemed disappointed when he canceled plans, which should have felt like relief, but instead left him with a strange unease he could not quite explain to himself. One evening, arriving home to find Claire already asleep despite it only being 9 in the evening, Daniel stood in the doorway of their bedroom for a long moment, studying her peaceful expression in the dim light. He thought about how easily she slept now, how rarely she waited up for him anymore, and wondered when exactly this had become the pattern of their lives. He wanted to wake her, to ask her something, anything, just to feel a genuine connection, rather than the polite, functional interactions that had become their default mode of communication. But he did not wake her. He simply closed the door quietly and went to his home office to finish more work, before eventually falling asleep on the couch, as had become increasingly common. Around this time, Claire's father, Edward, now fully recovered and living independently again, invited Claire and Daniel over for Sunday dinner, something he had started doing regularly to celebrate his renewed health and independence. Daniel attended these dinners when his schedule allowed, though he often arrived late or left early, checking his phone frequently throughout the meal. Edward, ever perceptive despite his quiet nature, watched these interactions carefully, noticing the way Claire had stopped even glancing at Daniel's phone use with the mild irritation she once displayed, now simply accepting it as an unremarkable part of their dynamic. After one such dinner, as Daniel helped clear the table before rushing off to handle an urgent work call, Edward pulled Claire aside briefly and asked how she was truly doing. Claire, perhaps emboldened by the comfortable familiarity of her father's kitchen, admitted more than she usually allowed herself to say aloud. She told him that she felt like a stranger in her own marriage, that she and Daniel functioned well as business partners managing a household, but had lost whatever emotional connection once made their relationship feel like love, rather than logistics. Edward listened without judgment, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and told his daughter something that stayed with her for a long time afterward. He said that love was not simply a feeling that either existed or disappeared on its own, but something that required consistent tending, like a garden that would eventually die without water and sunlight, no matter how strong its roots had once been. He gently suggested that perhaps it was time for her to think seriously about what she truly wanted for the remainder of her life, rather than continuing to accept a situation that clearly brought her little genuine happiness. Claire drove home that evening, turning her father's words over in her mind repeatedly, feeling a quiet clarity beginning to settle within her that had been building slowly for years. She was 36 years old, still young enough to imagine an entirely different future for herself. Yet she had spent the last several years of her life accepting steadily diminishing returns from a marriage that once promised so much more. She thought about her book club friends, several of whom had gone through divorces themselves and had spoken openly about the relief and renewed sense of self they experienced afterward, despite the initial difficulty of the transition. She did not arrive at any firm decision that night, but something had shifted permanently within her, a willingness to at least consider possibilities she had previously refused to entertain out of loyalty, fear, or simple habit. She began, quietly and without informing anyone, researching what a life independent from Daniel might actually look like, calculating finances, considering whether she could afford their current house alone, thinking through practical questions that felt both frightening and strangely liberating to explore. Meanwhile, Daniel remained largely consumed by the aftermath of his company's merger, spending increasing amounts of time integrating new teams, resolving conflicts between previously competing offices, and traveling more frequently than ever before. He told himself repeatedly that this intense period was temporary, that once the merger stabilized, he would finally have more time and energy to invest in his marriage, a promise he had made to himself many times before, without ever fully honoring it once circumstances allowed. During one particularly long business trip, Daniel found himself unexpectedly alone in a hotel room on a Friday evening. His meetings concluded earlier than planned, with several free hours ahead of him for the first time in weeks. Instead of catching up on emails as he usually would, he found himself scrolling through old photographs on his phone, eventually landing on pictures from his wedding day, nearly 13 years earlier. He stared at a photograph of himself and Claire laughing together during their first dance, both of them so young, so certain, so completely absorbed in each other in a way that felt almost unrecognizable compared to their current daily interactions. He felt an unexpected wave of longing wash over him, a genuine ache for the connection captured in that photograph, and he found himself calling Claire, something he rarely did anymore outside of practical necessity. She answered, slightly surprised by the unprompted call, and they spoke for nearly 40 minutes, longer than any conversation they had shared in months, discussing memories from their wedding, laughing about small details neither of them had thought about in years. For a brief moment, something of their old connection seemed to flicker back to life, and Daniel hung up the phone feeling genuinely hopeful, promising himself he would prioritize more moments like this once he returned home. That hope, however, proved difficult to sustain against the relentless demands of his position. Within days of returning from his trip, new crises emerged requiring his immediate attention, and the warmth of that phone conversation faded quickly beneath the accumulating pressure of his responsibilities. Claire noticed this familiar pattern repeating itself, the brief flicker of genuine connection, followed inevitably by a return to distraction and absence, and rather than feeling disappointed as she once would have, she simply observed it with a kind of weary recognition, further confirmation of conclusions she had already quietly reached. It was during this period that Daniel's mother Patricia, visiting for a weekend, spent an afternoon alone with Claire while Daniel attended to work matters in his home office. Patricia, never one to avoid direct conversation, asked Claire plainly whether she was truly happy in her marriage. Claire hesitated, unsure how honest to be with her mother-in-law, but something in Patricia's genuine concern encouraged her to speak more openly than she had planned. She admitted that she loved Daniel in the way one loves a familiar habit or a comfortable routine, but that she no longer felt the deep emotional connection that had once defined their relationship, and she was uncertain whether that connection could ever truly be restored after everything that had happened. Patricia listened carefully, her expression softening with what appeared to be genuine sadness, and admitted that she had noticed similar patterns in her own marriage to Daniel's father decades earlier, patterns she had worked hard to correct before it became too late. She encouraged Claire to be honest with Daniel about exactly how serious the situation had become, suggesting that perhaps he genuinely did not understand the depth of what he risked losing, absorbed as he was in the demands of building his career. She told Claire that men like Daniel and her own husband often needed a clear, direct warning before they truly grasped the consequences of their neglect, and that gentle hints, however frequent, rarely accomplished what a single honest conversation could achieve. Claire took these words seriously, recognizing the wisdom in them even as she doubted whether she still had the emotional energy to fight for something she had already begun quietly letting go of within herself. She thought about her private collection of letters hidden in her closet, The years of unspoken frustration and disappointment she had poured onto those pages instead of speaking them aloud, and she wondered whether the time had finally come to stop writing privately and start speaking honestly, regardless of how difficult or uncomfortable that conversation might prove to be. Over the following weeks, Claire found herself observing Daniel with a new kind of clarity, watching him move through their shared life with an intensity directed almost entirely toward his career, noticing how rarely he asked about her inner world, her hopes, her fears, the small daily experiences that made up the texture of her actual existence. She began to understand that his neglect was not necessarily born from a lack of love in some abstract sense, but from a profound failure to recognize that love required active demonstration, not simply passive coexistence within the same house. She decided, finally, that she owed it to herself and to whatever remained of their marriage to have one honest conversation with Daniel, stripped of the careful diplomacy she had employed for years to avoid conflict. She did not yet know exactly what she would say, or when the right moment might present itself, but she felt, for the first time in a long while, a sense of purposeful clarity about the direction her life needed to take, regardless of how Daniel ultimately responded to whatever she decided to share with him. The conversation Claire had been quietly preparing for finally arrived on an ordinary Thursday evening, without any special planning or dramatic setup, which somehow made it feel more significant than if she had scheduled it in advance. Daniel came home around 7, earlier than usual, and found Claire sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea already poured, one for herself and one, out of old habit, for him. He sat down across from her, sensing immediately that something about her expression was different, calmer and more deliberate than her usual polite distance. She told him, without preamble, that she needed to talk to him about something important, and something in her tone made Daniel set down his phone entirely, giving her his full attention in a way he rarely offered anymore. Claire took a slow breath and told him, as gently as she could manage while still being completely honest, that she did not love him anymore. Not in the way a wife should love her husband. She said the words calmly, without anger, without tears, simply stating a truth she had already made peace with, somewhere deep inside herself, over the preceding months. Daniel stared at her, momentarily speechless, the words landing with a force that seemed to physically push the air from his lungs. He had expected, at worst, another conversation about his work hours, another gentle complaint he could apologize his way through with promises of change. He had not expected this, the calm finality of her statement, delivered without the emotional intensity that might have suggested this was a passing frustration, rather than a settled conclusion she had already fully processed within herself. He asked her, his voice unsteady, what she meant exactly, hoping desperately that there was some misunderstanding, some exaggeration he could correct. Claire explained patiently, still without raising her voice, that she had spent years feeling invisible in their marriage, feeling like she carried the emotional weight of their relationship entirely alone, while he poured himself into his career. She told him about the canceled anniversary, about the hospital waiting room when her father nearly died, about the countless small moments over the years when she had needed him and found only silence or apologetic text messages in his place. Daniel tried to interrupt several times, wanting to explain, to apologize, to promise immediate and lasting change, but Claire held up her hand gently, asking him to simply listen for a moment longer before responding. She told him that she had tried, for years, to communicate her needs to him in smaller ways, through requests, through hints, through the conversation in the car after his parents' dinner over a year earlier, but that each time, any effort he made toward change had eventually collapsed under the pressure of his job, leaving her disappointed once again, and gradually less willing to invest hope in future promises. She explained, with a clarity that surprised even herself as she spoke, that she had stopped loving him, not in a single dramatic moment, but through years of accumulated disappointment, each canceled plan and missed conversation acting like a small withdrawal from an account that had eventually run completely dry. She said she did not blame him entirely, that she understood how easily ambition could consume a person's attention, but that understanding his reasons did not change the reality of what she had lost in the process, piece by piece, over years of quiet neglect. Daniel felt something crumbling inside his chest as he listened, a growing horror at the realization that this was not a temporary frustration he could quickly resolve with flowers and a sincere apology. He asked her, almost desperately, if there was anything he could do, any way to fix what had happened between them. His voice carrying a vulnerability Claire had not heard from him in years. Claire considered the question carefully, before answering honestly that she did not know, that she genuinely was not certain whether whatever remained between them could be rebuilt after everything that had eroded away over such a long period of time. She told him that she was not asking for a divorce, not yet, not necessarily ever, but that she needed him to understand the true severity of what had happened, rather than continuing to believe, as he apparently had, that their marriage remained fundamentally solid despite occasional friction. She told him that respect and affection still existed between them in some form, but that the deep, active love that once defined their relationship had quietly faded away, replaced by something closer to comfortable companionship between two people managing a shared household. Daniel sat in stunned silence for a long moment, processing everything Claire had shared, memories flooding back to him now with a painful new clarity. Moments he had dismissed at the time as minor inconveniences that he now recognized, in retrospect, as significant wounds he had carelessly inflicted upon someone he genuinely did love, even if his actions had failed to demonstrate that love consistently. He thought about the client meeting he had refused to interrupt while Claire waited alone at the hospital. He thought about the countless evenings he had chosen his laptop over conversation with his own wife. He asked her, quietly, if there was anyone else, some other reason behind this sudden distance, immediately regretting the question when he saw the flash of hurt cross Claire's face at the suggestion. She told him firmly that there was no one else, that this had nothing to do with infidelity or external temptation, and everything to do with the slow accumulation of his absence from their marriage over many years. She said that sometimes people did not need another person to fall out of love with their spouse. Sometimes the marriage itself simply became a place where love could no longer survive, starved of the attention it required to remain alive. Daniel apologized repeatedly throughout the remainder of their conversation, his apologies growing more desperate as the true weight of Claire's calm certainty settled over him. He promised to quit some of his work commitments, to seek counseling, to do whatever was necessary to rebuild what they had lost together. Claire listened to these promises with a weariness that suggested she had already heard similar commitments many times before, though this time she recognized something different in his tone, a genuine terror at the possibility of losing her entirely, rather than his usual reflexive reassurance meant to end an uncomfortable conversation quickly. She told him, gently but honestly, that she appreciated his willingness to try, but that she could not promise him her feelings would simply return because he made new commitments, however sincere they seemed in this particular moment. She explained that trust and love, once eroded significantly over time, could not be rebuilt through a single conversation or even a few weeks of improved behavior. She said that if he truly wanted to attempt repairing their marriage, it would require sustained, consistent effort over a long period, without any guarantee that her feelings would eventually return, even with his best efforts. Daniel agreed to whatever terms she proposed, desperate to preserve any possibility of saving their marriage, though the uncertainty of the situation left him feeling more anxious and unmoored than he had felt in years. That night, lying awake long after Claire had fallen asleep beside him, he replayed their conversation repeatedly in his mind, searching for the exact moment when things had gone so wrong, unable to identify a single decisive turning point, understanding for the first time that the damage had accumulated slowly, through 1,000 small failures rather than one significant mistake he could point to and correct. Over the following days, Daniel began making genuine changes to his schedule, leaving work earlier despite the discomfort this caused among his colleagues, who had grown accustomed to his constant availability. He scheduled a session with a marriage counselor, something Claire agreed to attend alongside him, though she made clear that attending counseling did not guarantee any particular outcome for their relationship. He found himself, for the first time in years, genuinely curious about Claire's inner life, asking questions about her feelings, her fears, her hopes for the future, questions he realized with some shame he had rarely bothered asking during the many years of their marriage. Claire responded to these efforts with cautious openness, appreciating the genuine attempt while still protecting herself against the possibility of disappointment she had experienced so many times before. She did not withhold information from him during their counseling sessions, sharing honestly about the years of accumulated hurt, but she also did not pretend that Daniel's recent efforts had already restored the emotional connection they once shared. She remained uncertain, watching his behavior carefully, waiting to see whether this represented a lasting transformation or another temporary adjustment that would eventually collapse under the return of professional pressures. During one particularly difficult counseling session, the therapist asked Daniel directly what he believed had caused the distance in his marriage, hoping to help him articulate his own understanding of the situation, rather than simply reacting defensively to Claire's accusations. Daniel struggled to answer at first, then admitted, with evident difficulty, that he had allowed his identity to become almost entirely defined by his professional success, believing subconsciously that providing financial security for his family was sufficient, without recognizing that emotional presence and attention were equally, if not more, important to sustaining a genuine marriage. The therapist gently pointed out that many people fell into similar patterns, mistaking provision for presence, believing that hard work on behalf of their family excused their absence from that same family's daily emotional life. Daniel absorbed this observation with visible discomfort, recognizing its accuracy even as it forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own priorities over the preceding years. Claire watched him process this realization, feeling a complicated mixture of validation and sadness, wishing this understanding had arrived years earlier, before so much damage had accumulated between them. As weeks passed, Daniel continued his efforts with apparent sincerity, and Claire noticed genuine improvements in his behavior, more consistent presence at home, more thoughtful questions about her life, more attention paid to small details he would have previously overlooked entirely. Yet despite these positive changes, she found herself unable to simply return to the feelings she once held for him, the years of accumulated disappointment, creating a kind of emotional distance that his current efforts, however genuine, could not immediately dissolve. She recognized this as one of the cruelest aspects of what had happened between them, that his willingness to change had arrived only after she had already released her hope for change entirely, leaving them both caught in a painful gap between his newfound effort and her already settled acceptance of loss. Several months into their counseling sessions, Daniel found himself increasingly desperate to understand exactly when their marriage had begun to unravel, hoping that identifying specific moments might help him fully grasp the depth of what Claire had experienced and perhaps offer some path toward genuine repair. He began revisiting old photographs stored in boxes in their garage, looking through years of accumulated memories, searching for clues about the gradual transformation that had occurred between them without his awareness. One Saturday afternoon, while Claire was out running errands with Grace, Daniel decided to reorganize their bedroom closet, a task Claire had mentioned wanting to tackle for months, but never finding time to complete, given her busy schedule caring for her father and maintaining her own commitments. He thought a surprise reorganization might serve as a small, thoughtful gesture, demonstrating his continued effort to contribute more actively to their shared domestic life, something Claire had gently pointed out during counseling that she had managed almost entirely alone for years. As he worked through her side of the closet, carefully organizing shoes and folding sweaters that had fallen into disarray, he encountered the old shoebox tucked into the back corner, the same box he had noticed once before, years earlier, without ever investigating its contents. This time, curiosity overcame his previous hesitation, and he lifted the box down, opening it carefully, expecting perhaps old photographs or sentimental keepsakes from before their marriage. Instead, he found a thick envelope, worn soft at the edges from apparently being handled many times over an extended period, filled with numerous folded pages covered in Claire's familiar handwriting. His heart began beating faster as he recognized this was not an ordinary keepsake, but something far more personal, something Claire had clearly written and kept hidden rather than shared with him directly. He hesitated for a long moment, aware that reading private writings without permission represented a significant violation of trust, yet unable to resist the pull of finally understanding, in Claire's own unfiltered words, exactly what she had experienced during the years of their marriage. He sat down slowly on the edge of their bed, the envelope trembling slightly in his hands, and made the decision to read what Claire had written, telling himself that understanding her pain fully, even through this uninvited method, might ultimately help him become the husband she needed, rather than continuing to guess at the true depth of damage his neglect had caused. He unfolded the first pages carefully, recognizing immediately that these entries dated back years, beginning shortly after her father's emergency surgery, a date he remembered with painful clarity as one of his most significant failures. The early pages described, in raw and unguarded language completely different from the calm, measured tone Claire typically used when discussing their marriage aloud, The devastating loneliness she had experienced, sitting in that hospital waiting room alone, watching other families supporting each other, while she faced her father's surgery, without her own husband beside her. She wrote about the 4 hours of waiting, the fear for her father's life, compounded by the growing certainty that she had become entirely invisible within her own marriage, someone Daniel would choose to abandon during her most vulnerable moments, whenever his career demanded otherwise. Daniel read these words with a physical ache building in his chest, memories of that day returning with painful new clarity, the client meeting he had prioritized, the 4 missed calls he had silenced without immediate concern, believing at the time that his delay would not significantly matter to the outcome. Reading Claire's account of that day, the visceral terror and loneliness she had experienced forced him to fully confront, perhaps for the first time, the true human cost of decisions he had made almost automatically, without conscious cruelty, but with devastating consequences nonetheless. He continued reading through subsequent entries, each one documenting a specific instance of disappointment he had caused: canceled dinners, forgotten conversations, birthdays remembered late, entire weekends where his physical presence in their home had felt, according to Claire's own words, more isolating than if he had simply been away entirely, since his distracted presence constantly reminded her of the connection she was missing, rather than allowing her to simply accept his absence. Each entry built upon the last, painting a comprehensive picture of accumulated neglect that Daniel had never fully appreciated, despite living through every individual moment alongside her. Perhaps most painful of all were the earlier entries, written when Claire still held genuine hope that things might improve. Entries filled with desperate love and yearning for the connection they once shared, small prayers written to no one in particular, hoping Daniel might notice her efforts, might remember an anniversary without prompting, might ask about her day without needing to be reminded that she too had experiences worth sharing. These early entries revealed a woman still fighting fiercely for her marriage, still believing deeply in the possibility of restoration, a stark contrast to the calm, settled acceptance he had witnessed more recently. As he continued reading, moving through pages written over successive months and years, Daniel noticed the gradual transformation in Claire's tone, the fierce hope of earlier entries slowly giving way to weary resignation, and eventually to something resembling peaceful acceptance of loss. The most recent entries, written just months before her direct conversation with him at the kitchen table, contained none of the desperate yearning present in earlier pages, instead describing a settled decision to stop hoping entirely, to build a life independent of his attention, rather than continuing to wait for a change she no longer believed would materialize. One particular passage struck Daniel with devastating force, a section where Claire had written about watching him sleep peacefully, one night after another canceled anniversary dinner, describing the strange sensation of lying beside someone she had once loved completely, now feeling like nothing more than a polite stranger sharing the same bed, out of habit and convenience, rather than genuine connection. She had written that this realization frightened her more than any argument ever could, the quiet certainty that love could genuinely die within a marriage without either person fully acknowledging its passing, until it had already disappeared entirely. Daniel sat motionless for a long time after finishing the letters, the weight of everything he had just read settling over him like a physical burden he could barely support. He understood now, with a clarity that felt almost unbearable, exactly what Claire had endured throughout their marriage, not through vague accusations during their counseling sessions, but through her own raw, unfiltered words, written during moments of genuine private anguish that she had never intended for him to see. The letters revealed a depth of pain and disappointment far more extensive than anything she had ever directly communicated to him, even during their most honest counseling conversations. He heard the garage door open downstairs, signaling Claire's return from her errands, and quickly gathered the pages back into their envelope, his hands shaking as he attempted to return everything to its original position within the shoebox. He was not certain whether he should tell her he had found and read her private writings, uncertain whether this admission would represent a genuine step toward the transparency their counselor had emphasized as essential for rebuilding trust, or whether it would constitute yet another violation, this time of her privacy rather than her emotional needs. Claire came upstairs a few minutes later, finding Daniel sitting quietly on the edge of their bed, his expression troubled in a way she immediately recognized as significant. She asked him what was wrong, and Daniel, after a long, difficult moment of hesitation, decided that continued honesty represented the only path forward he genuinely believed in. regardless of how uncomfortable the admission might prove. He told her, quietly and with evident shame, that he had found and read her letters while reorganizing her closet, that he understood now, in ways he never fully had before, exactly what she had experienced throughout their marriage. Claire's initial reaction was a flash of anger at the violation of her privacy, years of private thoughts exposed without her consent or knowledge. She asked him sharply why he had continued reading, once he realized what the letters contained, rather than immediately closing the envelope and respecting the clear boundary of her personal thoughts. Daniel apologized sincerely, admitting he should have stopped immediately, but explaining that once he began reading, he found himself unable to look away, desperate to finally understand the full extent of pain he had caused, even through this admittedly inappropriate method of discovery. Despite her initial anger, as Claire processed the situation further, she recognized something significant in Daniel's reaction to what he had read, a genuine devastation in his expression that seemed to reflect authentic understanding, rather than simple guilt at being caught violating her privacy. She asked him carefully what exactly he had read, and as he began describing specific entries, she realized he had, in fact, read through the entire collection, absorbing years of her private pain in a single afternoon, gaining an understanding that months of careful counseling conversations had only partially achieved. That evening, after the initial shock and tension of Daniel's confession had settled slightly, Claire made an unexpected decision. She told him that since he had already read most of her private letters, there was little point in pretending the boundary of privacy remained intact, and instead of continuing to feel violated by his discovery, she chose to sit with him and discuss the letters directly, believing this honest confrontation might accomplish more than continued secrecy ever could. She retrieved the shoebox herself this time, placing it on the kitchen table between them, and began pulling out specific letters, reading portions aloud in her own voice, rather than allowing Daniel's memory of reading them privately to stand as the only record of what she had written. She started with the earliest entry, written the night of her father's surgery, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words she spoke, describing in her own voice the terror and loneliness of that hospital waiting room, the moment when something inside her had begun, almost imperceptibly, to close off from him. Daniel listened in silence, tears forming in his eyes as he heard, in Claire's actual voice rather than simply through his own reading, the full weight of what she had experienced during that crisis. He apologized again, more specifically this time, acknowledging the exact failure she described, rather than offering a general apology for his overall neglect. Claire nodded, appreciating this specificity, and continued reading through subsequent letters, each one revealing another layer of accumulated disappointment, another small death of hope she had experienced silently, while maintaining a composed exterior, for the sake of their household stability. As she read through entry after entry, Daniel began to understand something crucial he had missed even during his private reading of the letters: the sheer persistence of Claire's hope throughout the early years. How many times she had genuinely believed things might improve. How much effort she had invested internally in maintaining optimism about their marriage, even while receiving so little external evidence to support that hope. He realized that her eventual withdrawal had not come easily or quickly, but only after years of genuine struggle to preserve something she deeply valued, finally exhausting her capacity for continued hope, only after exhausting every reasonable alternative first. When Claire reached the final letters, the ones written more recently, describing her decision to stop hoping entirely and to build an independent life regardless of his presence or absence, her voice grew quieter, more measured, reflecting the settled peace she had genuinely found in that acceptance. Daniel asked her, his voice barely above a whisper, whether that peace remained intact even now, months into his genuine efforts to change, or whether some small part of the hope she had released might still be recoverable, given sustained effort on his part. Claire considered the question seriously for a long moment, before answering honestly that she genuinely did not know, that the letters represented her authentic feelings at the time she wrote them, but that months had passed since the most recent entry, months during which Daniel had demonstrated consistent, meaningful change that she had not previously believed possible. She acknowledged that something within her had begun to soften slightly in response to his sustained effort, though she remained cautious about fully trusting this shift, aware of how many times similar hope had previously been disappointed by his eventual return to old patterns. She told him that reading the letters together, rather than simply having him discover them privately, had actually helped her process years of accumulated pain in a way she had never expected, transforming private anguish into shared understanding between them for the first time. She said that perhaps this was exactly the kind of honest confrontation their marriage had always needed, years earlier, before so much damage had accumulated silently between two people who had once loved each other deeply, but had lost the ability to communicate that love in ways the other person could actually feel and recognize. Daniel asked her what she needed from him moving forward, genuinely committed now to understanding, rather than simply promising vague future improvement. Claire thought carefully before answering, drawing on months of counseling insights, combined with the raw honesty the letters had finally allowed between them. She told him she needed consistent, active presence, not grand gestures or occasional dramatic efforts, but the daily accumulation of small moments of genuine attention, the same kind of gradual accumulation that had eroded their marriage over years, now needing to work in reverse to rebuild it slowly and authentically. She explained that she could not promise her love would fully return simply because he asked, or because he demonstrated genuine remorse over what he had read. Love, she said, echoing her father's earlier wisdom, required consistent tending over time, and while she was willing to remain open to the possibility of rebuilding what they had lost, she needed him to understand that this process would require patience and sustained effort, without guarantee of a particular outcome. Exactly the kind of uncertainty he would need to accept if he genuinely wanted to remain committed to their marriage moving forward. Daniel agreed to these terms without hesitation, feeling a strange mixture of devastation at everything he had learned about the pain he had caused, combined with a fragile hope that perhaps, even now, something meaningful could still be rebuilt between them, if he committed himself fully to the sustained effort Claire described. He asked if he could keep one of the letters, not to use against her or bring up during future disagreements, but simply as a permanent reminder of exactly what neglect had cost them both, something to reference whenever work pressures threatened to pull him back toward his old patterns of prioritizing career over connection. Claire agreed, selecting the letter describing the hospital waiting room, believing this particular entry captured most powerfully the human cost of the choices he had made, and hoping its permanent presence in his life might serve as a genuine safeguard against future neglect, rather than simply a temporary source of guilt that would fade over time. She folded the letter carefully and handed it to him, watching his expression as he accepted it, recognizing something in his careful, deliberate handling of the paper that suggested he understood its significance far beyond the words written on its surface. In the weeks that followed this pivotal evening, Daniel's behavior continued to evolve in ways that felt increasingly authentic rather than performative, as though the letters had accomplished something that months of counseling conversations had only begun to achieve, a full internalization of exactly what his neglect had cost the woman he loved. He began keeping the letter Claire had given him in his wallet, occasionally rereading it during moments when work pressures tempted him toward his old patterns, using it as a genuine touchstone, reminding him of the consequences awaiting continued neglect. Claire, meanwhile, continued observing his changed behavior with cautious hope, allowing herself, slowly and carefully, to reinvest small amounts of trust and openness into their marriage, though she remained honest with herself and with Daniel about the uncertainty of whether her deeper feelings of love could ever fully return to their previous intensity. She continued her own independent pursuits, her book club, her yoga classes, her close relationship with Grace, recognizing that whatever happened with Daniel, she had built a fuller, more complete sense of herself over the preceding years, that she did not intend to abandon entirely, even if their marriage eventually recovered fully. A full year passed since the afternoon Daniel discovered the letters hidden in Claire's closet, and the marriage that emerged from that painful discovery looked meaningfully different from the one that had existed before. Daniel had stepped back from some of his most demanding responsibilities at work, negotiating with his company for a role that still allowed professional growth but no longer required the constant travel and unpredictable hours that had once consumed nearly all of his attention. His colleagues noticed the change, some admiring his apparent newfound balance, others quietly questioning whether he had lost his previous ambitious edge, opinions Daniel found he genuinely no longer cared much about compared to the priority he now placed on his marriage. Claire noticed these changes accumulating steadily over the months, not through single dramatic gestures but through the consistent, daily presence her father had once told her love required to survive. Daniel asked about her day and actually listened to her answers, remembering details from previous conversations, following up on concerns she had mentioned weeks earlier. He attended her father's Sunday dinners consistently, arriving on time and staying fully present rather than checking his phone throughout the meal. He remembered anniversaries and birthdays without needing reminders, planning small, thoughtful gestures that demonstrated genuine attention to her preferences rather than generic, last-minute efforts. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Claire found herself experiencing moments of genuine warmth toward Daniel that she had not felt in years, small flickers of the connection they once shared, reappearing during unexpected moments. A shared laugh over dinner, a comfortable silence during a car ride that no longer felt hollow, but instead felt peaceful, in a way that echoed their earliest years together. She remained cautious about fully trusting these feelings, aware of how easily hope had been disappointed in the past, but she allowed herself, increasingly, to believe that perhaps genuine repair was possible after all, even after so much accumulated damage. They continued attending counseling sessions regularly, though the tone of these sessions had shifted considerably from the raw, painful confrontations of the earlier months to more constructive conversations about maintaining the progress they had achieved together. Their therapist commented, during one particular session, on how rare it was to witness a couple successfully rebuild genuine connection after such extensive accumulated neglect, noting that many marriages facing similar patterns ended in permanent separation, rather than authentic repair, and attributing their progress largely to Daniel's sustained willingness to change, combined with Claire's courage in finally expressing her true feelings honestly, rather than continuing to suffer silently. On the anniversary of the difficult conversation at their kitchen table, the moment Claire had told Daniel she no longer loved him, they sat together at that same table, reflecting on the distance they had traveled together over the preceding year. Daniel reached into his wallet and pulled out the worn letter Claire had given him months earlier, its edges now soft from frequent handling, and told her that rereading her words regularly had fundamentally changed how he approached every decision at work, every moment when he might have previously prioritized professional demands over presence with his family. Claire listened to this admission with genuine emotion, recognizing the sincerity behind his words, understanding that the letter she had given him, rather than remaining simply a symbol of past pain, had become an active tool guiding his ongoing transformation. She told him, her voice steady but filled with cautious hope, that she could feel her love for him returning, not in the same form it had existed during their earliest years together, but in a new, perhaps more resilient form, built on the honest confrontation of their difficulties, rather than the naive optimism of young love that had once carried them through their wedding day. They spent that evening talking late into the night, something they had not done in years, discussing not just practical logistics, but genuine hopes and fears for their future together. The kind of deep conversation that had once defined their relationship before Daniel's career had gradually consumed his attention. Claire mentioned, during this conversation, that she had continued adding entries to her collection of letters even during the months of active rebuilding, though these newer entries carried a fundamentally different tone from the earlier ones, documenting genuine hope and gradual healing, rather than accumulated disappointment and eventual resignation. Daniel asked if he could read these newer entries, and Claire agreed, retrieving the shoebox once again, though this time the exchange felt entirely different from the tense confrontation of the previous year. He read through pages, describing small moments of renewed connection, cautious hope gradually building into something more substantial, genuine gratitude for his sustained effort, combined with continued honest acknowledgement of moments when old fears occasionally resurfaced, despite the overall positive trajectory of their relationship. One particular entry, written just weeks earlier, described a moment when Daniel had canceled an important work commitment, specifically to attend a difficult appointment with Claire's father, a small gesture that nonetheless carried enormous symbolic weight given the history between them. Claire had written about watching Daniel make that choice, prioritizing her family over his professional obligations, and feeling something within her finally begin to trust that this transformation represented genuine, lasting change, rather than another temporary adjustment destined to collapse under future pressure. Reading this entry, Daniel felt an overwhelming mixture of relief and continued determination, understanding that his ongoing effort was genuinely working, that Claire's trust was slowly being restored through consistent action rather than empty promises. He told her that he intended to continue prioritizing their marriage indefinitely, not as a temporary correction, but as a fundamental shift in how he approached his entire life moving forward. Recognizing now, with painful clarity earned through nearly losing everything that mattered most to him, that professional success meant nothing if it came at the cost of genuine connection with the people he loved. Their marriage did not return to some idealized version of perfection, and both Daniel and Claire understood this reality clearly. They still occasionally disagreed, still faced moments of stress and miscommunication like any couple navigating a long-term relationship. But something fundamental had shifted between them, a mutual understanding of exactly how easily love could erode through consistent neglect, and equally, how genuine, sustained effort could slowly rebuild what had once seemed permanently lost. They had both learned, through painful experience, that love within a marriage was not simply a feeling that either persisted automatically or disappeared without warning, but an active choice, requiring daily attention and genuine presence from both partners. As they eventually decided to renew their wedding vows, exactly 2 years after the difficult conversation that had marked the true turning point in their marriage, Claire chose to include a reading from one of her earliest letters during the small, intimate ceremony they planned, believing it important for both of them to remember exactly how close they had come to losing everything, and exactly what sustained effort and honest communication had ultimately allowed them to rebuild together. Standing before their small gathering of family and close friends, Daniel listened to Claire read her own words aloud, words describing devastating loneliness and eventual acceptance of loss, and felt profound gratitude that they had found their way back to each other before that acceptance became permanently irreversible. Grace, standing among the small gathering of witnesses, watched her sister and brother-in-law with genuine happiness, remembering the difficult years when she had worried privately that their marriage was beyond repair. Edward, seated in the front row despite his continued recovery, felt proud watching his daughter demonstrate the courage to demand genuine change rather than simply accepting continued unhappiness, understanding that her willingness to finally speak honestly, combined with Daniel's genuine capacity for transformation, had together created something neither of them could have achieved alone. As the ceremony concluded and their small celebration began, Daniel pulled Claire aside for a private moment, reaching into his jacket pocket to retrieve the original worn letter he had carried in his wallet for nearly 2 years, its paper now soft and creased from countless readings. He told her that he wanted her to have it back now, not because he no longer needed its reminder, but because he believed they had finally reached a point where its message had been fully honored, through sustained action, rather than requiring constant reference to prevent backsliding into old patterns. Claire accepted the letter, folding it carefully, and placing it in her own pocket, understanding the symbolic significance of this exchange, the transformation of a document that once represented devastating pain into something closer to a testament of hard-won growth and genuine healing. She told Daniel that she loved him, not as she had during their earliest years together, naive and untested by real difficulty, but as she did now, having witnessed firsthand exactly what he was capable of when he chose consistently to prioritize their connection over every other competing demand in his life. They returned to their celebration, surrounded by family who had watched their journey from painful distance back toward genuine connection, both of them understanding clearly that their marriage would continue requiring active effort and attention indefinitely, that love once nearly lost through neglect required permanent vigilance to prevent similar erosion in the future. But standing together that evening, having survived the most difficult chapter of their relationship and emerged genuinely stronger on the other side, they felt confident that whatever challenges the future might bring, they now possessed both the honest communication and the demonstrated commitment necessary to face them together, rather than allowing silent accumulated disappointment to once again slowly dissolve the love they had worked so hard to rebuild. 5 years after their vow renewal, Daniel and Claire's life had settled into a rhythm neither of them could have imagined during the darkest period of their marriage. Daniel had eventually left his corporate position entirely, choosing instead to start a smaller consulting business that allowed him far greater control over his schedule, a decision that would have seemed unthinkable to the ambitious younger version of himself, who once measured his entire worth through professional titles and quarterly performance numbers. Claire had been promoted to lead counselor at her school, a role she approached with the same steady presence she had learned to demand within her own marriage. Their daughter, born 2 years after the renewal ceremony, had brought an entirely new dimension to their relationship, one that tested Daniel's commitment to presence in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. There were nights when exhaustion and the demands of parenting a young child threatened to pull them back toward the old pattern of distracted coexistence, rather than genuine connection. But both of them recognized these warning signs now, having learned through painful experience exactly how quickly small compromises could accumulate into significant distance if left unaddressed. During one particularly difficult stretch, when Daniel's consulting business faced an unexpected financial challenge requiring intense focus over several weeks, Claire noticed familiar patterns beginning to re-emerge: longer hours, distracted conversations, moments when Daniel's attention seemed to drift toward his laptop rather than remaining present with her and their daughter. Rather than allowing this pattern to continue silently, as she once might have, she addressed it directly within days rather than years, referencing the lessons both of them had learned through their difficult history together. Daniel responded immediately to her honest observation, recognizing the early warning signs himself once she pointed them out, and made deliberate adjustments before the pattern could establish itself as a new, damaging normal. This exchange, brief and relatively undramatic compared to the painful conversations of their earlier crisis, demonstrated exactly how thoroughly they had internalized the hard-won wisdom from their difficult years, catching small drift before it could accumulate into significant distance, communicating openly, rather than allowing silent disappointment to build unaddressed. Claire still kept her collection of letters, though she had added far fewer entries in recent years, and those she did write carried an entirely different character from the desperate hope and eventual resignation of her earlier writing. Recent entries documented small moments of genuine happiness, gratitude for a marriage that continued to require active effort but consistently received it from both partners, and occasional reflections on how strange it felt to remember the woman she had once been, someone who had nearly given up entirely on the possibility of feeling truly seen within her own marriage. Grace, now living closer after her own career change brought her to the same town, remained close with Claire, occasionally reminiscing about the difficult years when she had worried whether her sister's marriage could survive. During one conversation, Grace asked Claire whether she ever regretted the painful period they had endured, wondering if a different path, perhaps ending the marriage during its darkest moments, might have led to a happier outcome overall. Claire considered the question seriously, understanding it deserved an honest answer rather than a simple reassurance. She told Grace that she did not regret the difficult years, not because the pain itself held any inherent value, but because surviving that period together, through honest confrontation, rather than continued silent suffering, had ultimately created a marriage far stronger and more resilient than the one that existed before Daniel's neglect had nearly destroyed everything they built together. She explained that she and Daniel now possessed something many couples never developed: an intimate understanding of exactly how their specific patterns of behavior could either nurture or destroy their connection, knowledge earned through genuine crisis rather than theoretical discussion. Edward, now in his mid-70s and enjoying his continued good health, often remarked during family gatherings on how proud he felt watching his daughter's marriage evolve from something that had genuinely worried him during its darkest period into a partnership he considered a model for his grandchildren to eventually learn from. He occasionally reminded Claire, during quiet moments together, of the advice he had offered years earlier about love requiring active tending like a garden, telling her that few people ever truly internalized that wisdom until circumstances forced the lesson upon them directly, as had happened within her own marriage. Daniel, for his part, had become something of an unofficial mentor to younger colleagues and friends who found themselves struggling with similar patterns of professional ambition overtaking personal relationships. He spoke openly, when appropriate, about his own history of neglect and the painful process of rebuilding trust with Claire, hoping his honesty might help others recognize warning signs earlier in their own relationships, rather than requiring a crisis as severe as the one he had nearly caused within his own marriage. He never mentioned these conversations without acknowledging that his transformation had only become possible because Claire had possessed the courage to speak her truth honestly, rather than continuing to suffer in silence indefinitely. The letter Claire had returned to him during their vow renewal ceremony remained framed in his home office, not displayed prominently for visitors to read, but positioned where he could see it during moments of quiet reflection, a permanent reminder of exactly what genuine neglect could cost, and exactly what sustained effort could ultimately restore. Occasionally, during particularly demanding periods at work, he found himself glancing toward that frame, recalling the devastating loneliness Claire had once described experiencing within their marriage, and using that memory as motivation to maintain the presence and attention he had worked so hard to develop. Their daughter grew up witnessing a marriage built on honest communication and consistent effort, rather than the silent accumulation of disappointment that had once nearly destroyed her parents' relationship before her birth. She would occasionally ask, as children sometimes do, about the framed letter in her father's office, curious about its significance, and Daniel and Claire made the deliberate choice to explain, in age-appropriate terms as she grew older, exactly what that letter represented, hoping the lesson embedded within their own difficult history might help her recognize similar warning signs earlier within her own future relationships. Looking back across the full span of their journey together, from the earliest years of genuine young love, through the slow accumulation of neglect and disappointment, through the painful discovery of hidden letters revealing years of unspoken pain, and finally toward the genuine, hard-won reconciliation they had built together, Daniel and Claire both recognized that their story offered no simple, easy lesson about avoiding difficulty entirely. Instead, it demonstrated something perhaps more valuable, that even severe damage within a marriage could potentially be repaired, given genuine honesty, sustained effort, and mutual willingness to confront painful truths directly, rather than allowing them to fester silently beneath a comfortable surface of polite avoidance. Claire often reflected, during quiet evenings with Daniel after their daughter had gone to sleep, that the woman who had once written those desperate, hopeful letters years earlier, and the woman who had eventually written the calm, settled acceptance of her final entries before their pivotal conversation, both existed within her still, alongside the woman she had become through the difficult process of rebuilding trust and connection with Daniel. She understood now that love within a long marriage was rarely a single, unchanging feeling, but something that could genuinely be lost and rediscovered, damaged severely and still ultimately repaired, provided both people remained willing to do the difficult, ongoing work required to sustain genuine connection across the inevitable challenges any long relationship would eventually face. Daniel, for his part, carried a permanent gratitude for the painful lesson he had learned, understanding clearly that he had come dangerously close to losing everything that ultimately mattered most to him, distracted by professional ambitions that, in retrospect, meant far less than the genuine connection he shared with his wife and daughter. He no longer measured his own worth primarily through career achievements, having learned through devastating near loss that presence and attention toward the people he loved represented a far more meaningful measure of a life well lived than any title or salary could ever provide. Their story, ultimately, was not one of perfect romance untouched by real difficulty, but something more honest, and perhaps more valuable, a genuine account of how severe neglect could nearly destroy even a marriage built on real love, and how honest confrontation, sustained effort, and mutual courage could ultimately rebuild something even stronger than what had existed before the crisis began. Claire's hidden letters, once a private record of devastating loneliness, had ultimately become the catalyst for genuine transformation, proving that sometimes the truths we are most afraid to speak aloud carry within them the exact power needed to save what we fear losing most completely.